Hello everyone, today we talk about the heretical pacifistic instances in the later Middle Ages. We already discussed some of these movements, the Cathars, or Albigensians, in particular the Waldensians as well. We haven't gone too much in depth about the Lollards. We talked about the Hussites as well, but today's reasoning is broader, right? It's mostly about the commonality in content that these texts, these ideologies, these various thinkers that we will encounter shared, and more particularly the proclivity towards the attempt to essentially from a minority condition, as always the heterodoxy is speaking from the fringe, in many ways, of, say, disciplining, which is paradoxical in a sense, the same authorities that were persecuting them and criticizing them essentially for the mere use of violence that was extended, let's say, within a Christian, doesn't matter whether heretical context, to, as we'll see now, in fact, the broader Western world, with the actual intent, or at least the presumption, of thinking that waging war in the first place is wrong always, in absolute terms, and should never be done, and those who do it are evil, etc. We will now observe, say, that there is a more theological explanation why this is complete insanity, but there is also, interestingly, like the historical response that was given at a point. So sometimes, because mostly during the Inquisition of these individuals, their trial, because otherwise, like, nobody would even take that seriously. And of course, there is a connection with what, say, lesser people in general think today war is. That is to say, they actually do not have the palest idea of what it is, sometimes even when they actually find one. And they tend to have this sort of weird, inconsistent, passive-aggressive attitude towards leadership, towards power, towards authority, for the mere fact, of course, that they're not able to handle it themselves, and of course must at that point criticize mostly any sort of Catholic endeavor, and therefore detaching from the traditional doctrine of power, which also is this point in history, which is a bit like the one of crisis of universal authority and the rise of movements that have sometimes also national character. Think about the Hussites. To an extent, is a much more complex thing that, however, disastrously failed, not just being ultimately defeated, but essentially destroying their own country in the process, that eventually went under other and not necessarily better rulers than ones they had before, starting from within the same people. Right, and this is not that the people, and not talking about the country, saying local national, not actually the commoners ever wanted this. I made actually an extensive amount of videos, as you know, that you can find in part in the playlist about medieval peasantry, regarding the peasant revolts that very often were endowed with this sense of, again, paradoxically violent, murderous, brutal outburst of, say, of revolt, of rebellion, or uprising, but clothed in some sort of, unironically pacifistic ideology, which is exactly what always happens still today. It's just like, you say, I don't know, the anti-war protests in, I don't know, think about the Vietnam War, even, I don't know, even the ones you can't see today, as a matter of fact. That is, what do you want? I want the war to be over because it's wrong. What do you really want? Like I want communism. That's actually what's behind that. And of course, I'm not even going to digress today on why, like, especially after having made a series about the Krieg as a critical commentary, why war, of course, is in itself is nor good nor bad. It's the political wielding of it that is mostly the issue. And of course there is a discriminant, right, between, say, what also must be updated constantly in the use of this mean, but that is not necessarily going to make less victims than a certain type of apparently peaceful policy. So all things that we explained so many times, I don't need to repeat myself on it. But what is fascinating, as I said before, is also seeing how authority at the time, in the later Middle Ages, handled this. And so it's not one of my favorite topics because, say, heresy is fascinating in so many ways. There are sort of better ways of studying it. But this sort of gives you a dimension of how sort of ridiculous these instances are, so that you can transpose the actual tendency, the pattern and sort of repetition of this insanity as it still is there. Naturally, there are reasons why this was the case, but the sense is that, say, if you look at the Jacquerie, or even at other systems at a certain point were heading towards a break, a crisis, aside from the fact that all these movements in the later Middle Ages lost and were brutally brought down and remained under for half of a millennium. So it's not like, they went anywhere. If they had the solution to the world problems, they would have succeeded, as actually also the entire Christian Catholic belief is founded on. And paradoxically, what this, let's say, the very, seed of this we'll explain it better, so at least militaristic concept is about, because pacifism is wrong, militarism, as long as we're talking about the isms, they are all wrong, right? You have to understand when to use violence or not, and that's all. That's the base in which you're judged by God, because simply the outcome is going to tell that in the first place. And people have difficulties with this because they have incredibly simplistic moral dichotomies whereby, I don't know, just if I defend my country, for example, I'm always right. And these are the same people that, however, will end up justifying, I don't know, other countries invading others, depending on their political sympathies, because they don't see war as, like there is a globe and things happen also in a historical perspective that can be very long, and politics being so multi-layered and complicated, etc. No, it is, let's focus to, like, this guy did this, so it's bad, or it's good. And so going by that. Unfortunately, this is how literally most adult, we're talking about actually living human beings. These people have children, they vote, they drive cars, they really exist. But they actually reason like this. We live in a world in which most people are like this. And so you don't have to wonder why. You should wonder mostly at how is it possible that we have a civilization to begin with. And thankfully, it's also because we burned people at the stake back in the day. And I'm not kidding at all. Also because these people were radical, very often radical leftistic terrorists that killed large amounts of people and prompted others to do so, but also were fighting, in this sense, against disgregation of order, right? The disgregation of actual, let's say, of all what, say, not me order just per se, but also in this sense in favor, something that they weren't absolutely able to destroy because it was way more solid than their, ideas, that surely weren't positive and did bring to, on the longer run, these are the prodromes of the Reformation. As a matter of fact, some of the same ideas we will find now. Because the world does degenerate, but also in order that had allowed these communities to rise in the first place historically, and that now, in a moment of crisis, of course, was experiencing the same responsibility for the same, including, for example, in clerical standards, etc. The mistake always was, criticize the individual, don't criticize the office, the institution. Doesn't matter, that had to be done, and everything towards a disgregational process that, yes, I found the point back again, that is to say, obviously bringing to violence, to decay, and to further actual in this period especially, like affirmation of more oppressive powers than before, right? And oppression, again, that is all on those that could take arms and succeed against them, but they wouldn't, because largely they were actually okay with that. And to an extent, because that was also sort of the best solution, because a system can be, in that sense, like there is a better person who rules over a worse one. How are you going to polemize against that, right? If the system is organic, it maintains actually the Catholic orthodoxy in this integration and sort of say cultivation of somebody's liberty within the system, which is really typical of the Middle Ages and medieval servitude even. Like where's the alternative? Is a world ruled by by these peasants that actually didn't even know, like they had all the numbers and the theoretical capacity to succeed, because they were the actual, say, they were vital as an estate themselves, but they went nowhere to begin with. This is not just the peasantry, but in general, say the lower estates tended to flirt with these ideas more, as long as they felt that in specific circumstances, not everywhere, by the way, were being left behind. And in part, again, you can understand it. If you look at the Jacquerie, after the French defeat of Poitiers, we made a pretty voluminous video about that battle. It's amazing, by the way. It's obvious that if you had, as a peasant, being relying on the French nobility, breaking your backs in the field for feeding their horses and producing their armor, and say just for them having this seigneury capable of protecting you, in the moment in which they failed, you'd have been a bit angry, wouldn't you? But that's still not the solution. Like, say, that's where these movements actually turn out to be particularly violent. In the case of the Jacquerie, there wasn't actually much heterodoxy, so I shouldn't simply bring this up today. But there are other instances, right? The Hussites in the first place, but also, let's say, if you had, this is not just about a religious heterodoxy. This is also a social issue, like a sociological idea of what the system should be about, and very often that was also that radical in French. So, given that these were all Christians, it doesn't really matter whether they were actually heretics at some point, but what kind of, I mean, that mattered, but say even if there hadn't been anything theologically or doctrinally wrong, it's still, the idea of a subversion of order would have been jarring on the basis also, frankly, what the world was pretty much in the same way, aside from some variation in balance, pretty much everywhere to begin with. And so there's a paradox that if you want to search for the most poignant and sort of open and complete expression of medieval non-violence, if not pacifism to an extent, you should search among the emarginated, among the heretics and their sympathizers, which, as you understand, as a definition, so in terms of social boundaries, is pretty wide, right? And so, again, today would be beautiful to digress on, say, the historical background of various movements that we'll be discussing about. But as you know, what is amazing really about the 13th, 14th century church accomplishment is that, coming from actually a lack of unified central control, they succeeded in convincing Europe that these movements were actually negative. You have, I say it all the time, like, aside from the fact that people lived under the nobiliar clienteles themselves, so what kind of life, like, okay, let's skip the strictly political, military, or even social connection, but in a strictly doctrinal one, right? There is an established order that, at the end of the day, whenever it's broken, it's damaging. This is pretty openly out there, right? There are situations in which it's wall against wall, and you have to fight, but it's not like it's ever much of a great enterprise to profit enormously from. It depends on the circumstances. Some were very profitable. The West expanded militarily in a quite successful way in many instances, and even the apparently lost enterprises, for those who especially count in terms of territorial acquisition, did bring something, even in a moral sense, right, to Western civilization. But let's leave this aside. Think about the fact that the Valdensians, in spite being persecuted by the Roman Church, gave her green light for exterminating the Cathars. Right, the idea that's also a very important concept. These people, very often, were actually not, say, speaking. In fact, even in terms of non-violence, for a deep belief that violence should not. That people had woken up one day and thought, say, violence should not be used in the first place. It was always. This must be always contextualized in the particular political background of the situation. Medieval society was violent, just by itself. Like, these communities were not, as we've seen, less violent than others. On the contrary, they were some of the most violent, and were toying around with, toying with the same concept of violence in order to, at the end of the day, sort of justifying their own. Right, this is extremely easy to see nowadays as well. Whoever expresses pacifistic attitudes, at the end of the day, is usually a very short-tempered, sort of emotionally unrestrained, say, frail, sort of emotionally frail individual with a very poor understanding of mankind, politics, history, and so even when you look at incredibly rash decisions in war making, that is hardly often the best answer, right? But it is sometimes. You realize how sort of completely severed from even probably the capacity of explaining why a war breaks out, right? Not even to judge whether it was kind of a good or bad choice in general, but in general, even to know what that is. And that is the expression of an extremely small world that, when sort of threatened by sort of perceived threat, escalate, makes such person starting actually to justify violence, because when it comes on their doorstep, like it seems like, except it's all talk, right? They're very easy people to tame at the end of the day. These are the same people that say, I don't know, everything is a microaggression, so we should use guns to stop, or extreme disproportionate, I don't know, social blaming for that. These are things that at a certain point that nobody cares about, right? They become irrelevant. That's simply not how the world works, and this is what emerges, I would say, from even this later medieval evidence, is that most of these ideas are completely irrelevant, right? You can't say that there's historically been a great thought stemming from such ideas. There isn't really any big pacifistic movement that was grounded on, some solid idea that eventually was developed further into some serious, finding real space in an institution, in a country, in politics. No, because war exists for very specific purposes, and war happens. You can't argue, unfortunately, because, of course, according to a Catholic principle, everything should be really immutable and perfect within itself, and so there shouldn't be any sort of conflict within the same. That's actually where the same heretics started from, except, in fact, skipping everything in between. That is the world, its sin, its burden, the fact that you're not so special at all. You see, there is a lot actually of wishful thinking regarding how to manage the war. I mean, do you think that saying war is bad is expressing any particular intelligence from your side, like in truly, again, political, historical, moral, scientific matters? No, wars are not made just because there is someone waking up in the morning deciding that is the case. It's always backed by some sort of broader point, whether it's going to turn out to be a failure or to be successful. And the fact that you don't see that, and that you think you can simply regulate it, especially from such minority standpoint, is just ludicrous per se. There isn't, at least, I'm sure that there is a literature on these topics about especially later medieval pacifism or non-violence, whatever you want to call it. But I think in this sense that the cultural temper of our times wouldn't actually bring it to the fore, right? It may be articles, papers of any kind, like discussing, I don't know, what this or that thinker in these centuries actually believed about war or not, and surely showing the nuance. And so the fact that, if anything, the war was actually accepted to some extent, violence, even if sinful, that's where the same Christians themselves started from, right? There was always a way to cope with this. I made lots of videos, especially about early Christianity, but it's really a problem that, as you know, predates the same Christendom, right? Pacifistic stances were not, first of all, do not belong to the Christian doctrine. Christianity and pacifism never had anything to do with one another. It may have been individual people who expressed pacifistic ideas, and these belonged almost exclusively to to a rigoristic and as such also extremistic, say, contexts. And in fact, they wouldn't have much of a success. The Christendom in general began to back secular authority and always had some, say, earthly respect for it to the extent it was a manifestation, if anything, of in part of divine power, but not to the absolute that Christianity was rebelliously sort of claiming, like, and asking for coming back to. So there is always this sort of liminal, to some extent, utopistic tension that is inherent to the fact that we should, and we have discussed it very often recently, come back to the unity of God. But the problem is how, and that's actually where you should start reasoning around violence. Aside from the fact that the Gospels actually have expressed notoriously a very violent language, probably in the deepest of its concept, and they must be, because there cannot be that coming back to the one without war and without enduring also that, and without having to resist in a way or another. Here, of course, part of the issue revolved around the criticism towards physical violence. That is to say, Christianly speaking, as also Catholically speaking, even in a pre-Christian sense, mere will to power should simply mold reality at your own will, right? So this poses already some problem, because if the idea is that you should imitate Christ in your life, of course you should tend to that ideal, but that doesn't mean that you actually can attain that even to a significant degree, or that you will, as you specifically. And so that not using violence has nothing to do, aside from the fact that Christ did use violence, not physical against other people, but in a general sense he was aggressive. Think about the temple, the merchants in the temple and so on. But of course he was God, so whatever he did, and even in that case, actually, that instance shows you how he was, in his human nature, quite relatable in everything he did, but to an extent that, of course, wouldn't need to exercise violence specifically, and I will not digress here on the issue of how bloodshed as a sin was seen in, at least in the Jewish world in Christ's time, because that would be interesting, but also make things more complicated. We stick to the medieval example. Like if you had to talk with these people, talk with a person that has this sort of non-violence or pacifistic stances, okay? It's not that if you do not kill anyone, you're basically like Christ. Christ is God. For the fact that you're a sinner in the first place, you cannot essentially be fully that, and you cannot exclude. So maybe you will not kill anyone in your life, nor fortunately have any sort of circumstances you have to do it, especially in a distressfully, emergential way. But the question is, let's say, does your the possibility of your existence starting from a sinful condition exclude in absolute terms specifically just killing. I mean, there are much worse things than killing. Besides the fact that, as you know, the correct translation also, like, thou shall not kill is actually thou shall not murder. There are two very different things, also illustrating that in the Bible, killing and murdering, like say, it's not about killing, rather, that always constitutes a sin because every action is, right? And violence, killing especially, is more heinous because of the sense that if you put an end to a human life, you're basically killing all the infinite potential that lives in it. But if we know, of course, what humans are, including yourself, in terms of how much you can enact of that infinity, that will remain mostly in potential, right? So there are things that you can do that are sort of, even without killing, enormously more powerful than what most people's lives would have actually been worth. So it's difficult to make this case because it all gets down to an infinite size. But the paradox being that these heretical movements were not peaceful at all, right? The Middle Ages weren't a place which, if you simply said something that went against the church, you were put to death ipso facto, or that there were wide communities. First of all, everybody, even heretics, often thought that Rome had, for example, to remain at the center of the church, that even the hierarchy was okay. That's also, however, how the paparistic evangelical movements were integrated within the Roman Church. That's how, as we were saying before, the Waldensians were okay with the Roman persecution of the Albigensians, while having their qualms with Rome and not being in a particularly optimal situation as well. But all these movements tended essentially to fuel revolts, to fuel fringe movements that did not belong also to the better part of society, right? The medieval times weren't just, I don't know, a few rich guys only, and say a mass of dispossessed that just begged for food, right? There was a pretty solid in-between that surely depended on the aforementioned guys that were indeed quite rich, but that were contributing to the system, because that's how medieval civilization evolved, and that's how it turned into the modern and then a contemporary one. So it wasn't really something really negative in itself. These people were okay with hierarchy. Even after the Reformation, of course, the system remained, say, traditionally hierarchical. So what these, we should also distinguish what these kind of movements really were. Who exploited them, for which goals, what was their limit, who actually believed in them or not, who were the Albigensians, for example. It's not really clear to say who was an Albigensian just in Occitania during the Crusade of Simon Montfort, right? Or what kind of allegiance existed towards this movement that was also copying the same identical structure of the Roman Church hierarchically, and having their own inquisition, by the way, so putting people to death, and having, in fact, very different ideas within the same. That's completely normal and obvious, right? So once you make 2 + 2 regarding these things, everything is much clearer than it should, right? Why did civilization remain, for at least the entire Middle Ages, Catholic? Why did heresies always belong to sort of fringe areas that sort of even flirted with enemies and did, other things that were definitely not placing them at the center of the system? A system that, in other cases, went on pretty solidly. Like, we look at Western civilization, throughout the Middle Ages, first of all, the West was much more, say, unitarily orthodox than even the East, right, in many ways. But also, the effort to express really that Catholic unity remained, in spite of all difficulties, at the center of the issue. In the later Middle Ages, things get a bit more complicated because, as we said, crisis of the universal authorities. So the greater difficulty after the mid-14th century crisis to even just have bigger authorities control, including not just the papacy and the empire, but kings even, just to control effectively larger systems, And you have some of these disasters. You have some failed states. You have some massive collapses. Again, the one caused by the Hussites is actually the most exemplificative, because in Europe, like especially in 15th century, there was no other event that can compare. Like literally, the Hussites destroyed Czechia. Like they lost 1/3 of their population. They made it fall under for good under others. More external rulers. They sort of dramatically impoverished the entire system. It was a complete disaster under any point. They lost everything they could lose. And just for what? Right? For a lack of vision about what anything had to be. In a concrete sense. Because one guy can have a good idea, or even expressing, again, some instances that make sense of protest, of revolt, etc. But if you do not have an actual plan of how to do anything at the end of the day, it's just like a perennial revolution. And you know what we mean here, also in other times in history, where the hell are you going to go? That's not civilization. That is useful as long as it can produce ideas that can provoke the Orthodox center that can understand or not. But when things go too far, normally these systems are brought down. Fortunately, because civilization does work, and when civilization fails, everything fails. These people go nowhere. They actually destroy their own system. They often fall prey of much worse system than they had before. And you can see this dissidence throughout all the rest of history really proceeding in the same identical way. So in the absence of a more complete and say especially courageous work on this topic, we can look at a bunch of notes here. For example, at the beginning of the 13th century, a group of Valdensians was persuaded by Pope Innocent III, this is the peak of a Roman Catholic power, as you know, historically, to actually coming back into the church, the official church of Rome, in exchange for what? For the exemption from military service. This is quite interesting. I made, as I said before, lots of videos about the paparistic evangelical movements, and we noticed how fundamentally the church managed to win over all this sort of heterodox movements that were quite ambiguously, including the Franciscans originally, like that had all these instances of church reform and renewal, and that in part had turned openly towards openly heretical directions, and even taking arms against constituted authority, because that's what it all ended up normally in. And the church managed to convince, with the means of the time, which are not, I don't know, the 20th century totalitarian state coercive ones, like of the nation state, they are something incredibly looser and based on, say, just this moral dimension, to actually remain within the mother church and essentially going on, also in a very positive way. When you look at the later Middle Ages, you realize that the church was spreading literacy. The whole Black Legend about the Inquisition being bad, about the popes burning books, whatever. It's like there are so many wrong things with that to begin with, including the fact that, for example, the Inquisition was the only truly guarantistic tribunal existing ever. Like, if the other tribunals were functioning just with the king deciding that you had to go to jail, that's it. The Inquisition worked in an incredibly scrupulous way, with all the proofs rendered necessary, with very open, evidence use and procedure and method. It also fostered and bolstered dramatically literacy, right? By the 16th century, within the Roman Church, it was ridiculous to conceive, like among cardinals, to burn, for example, a woman for witchcraft. This is something that in New England continued until the 18th century. There is a whole dimension of Catholic culture people still today do not properly have the palest idea of, including the fact, for example, child abuse is much higher in the Protestant churches, except those are more scattered, so they are more individually I don't know, mimetic in the way that they can obscure the thing. Everything has become so popularly and forestatedly sort of cheap and vile that nobody really understands if history at this point has become just a mere optional, or if people actually think that they can't go out there saying things without even having the evidence in front of them. But without this aspect, here you realize how sort of, say, practically oriented the church was still by the time such an incredibly powerful pope that saved Christendom, not just from the heresy, but managed to re-bolster the Reconquista, brought to the fall of Constantinople, re-expanded, say, Latin stability in an unprecedented way in the history of Christendom. Too much. Innocent III was a hell of a pope, one of the greatest rulers in the history of mankind, that did an incredible good in recompacting a world that was really on the brink of possible collapse, including because of the integration of the Poperistic evangelical movements. And here you have literally the Valdensians, that definitely are, a tough nut to crack. In fact, doesn't quite crack, but at least in this group is redeemed, and however at a price, right? The fact that where these people lived, naturally this wasn't much just about ecclesiastical decision, but a political lay one. They would have not been eligible for military service. And one of the reasons was, of course, that the idea was the one of non-violence, etc. But in very practical terms, of course, this was just escaping military service, which is also not really a very positive thing, because military service is not even, again, used to do what, right? When you have to pacify a situation, for which reason? For public order, for general, like, whatever. Here, they were putting on the fact that we don't want to kill. I want to repeat, because I explained it in the so many videos I made on the early Christendom. There's no evidence in the army of all the vast numbers of Christians and all the martyrology, right, revolving around properly the military saints, of an instance of a Christian soldier that thought that they couldn't be soldiers because they would kill someone, right? The entirety of the geographical production tells us that it was because they did have to accept the divinity of the emperor that they refused. There was nothing among these military careerists that had truly killed vast amounts of people that for them was anything strange for them in killing a person, especially as a soldier, for the earthly purpose that had, right? This is also incredibly important. If you don't understand the double-threaded dimension of existence, I made a video about this, the doctrine of the two natures, you cannot fully understand how you shouldn't really mix in an absolute sense your earthly life with your spiritual one, right? There is a vast difference, and the point is that you're judged by God exactly for what you're doing in order to recompose unity in this world that has to pass, and you're flowed to an extent that it's highly unlikely to be able to save the world, thus yourself, to the point that you should, if anything, do your best in this condition to come back to the one. And you can't do it if you do not reverse the say the same sin that you have, that has burdened you over the generation since the fall, and that can pass definitely through, for example, saving somebody's life by killing someone who wants to take it away, right? And it is something that, in a general sense, wars are fought over, right? Because even if you, like, the people, it's all about money, man. What do you do with money? It's not like money are an end to itself. Like, the ultimate purpose of life on earth is to to reproduce, to continue on, to stabilize, to become secure, to further grow and develop and become more powerful. So whichever enterprise is aimed at actually increasing life, right? So it's not like if you fight in a war, you kill a bunch of people, the sense is, okay, this is the irreparable thing that, will have messed up the entire thing. No, it will be a accumulation of sin, but to an extent it may have actually avoided other sin from happening, and thus having had the possibility of good things to have happened further eliminate other chances for this to happen again. And so you always have a chance of redemption. And in many traditional ways, there is actually, and I explained this in the video about the way of the left hand, actually even and possibly a necessity of killing in order to redeeming the world and bring it back to what it is. At least it can pass through that. Ideally, again, yes, it should be just about pure will and pure action without necessity of, say pure will without the necessity to do anything, like just an action that is in the actualization of yourself by a divine standard. But at that point, the laws of the universe would change to an extent that, humanly speaking, we can't even grasp. And at that point, what will have, say, the past life actually, or killing in the sense, being about? In that, it's not something you can't quite understand. Like claiming that the only thing you should never do is killing, and not even mistranslating the Bible as that actually says not murdering, which obviously stress what, say, the moral reason why you killed, as everybody way legal system in the world does. Like you don't go to jail just because you killed someone. You go to jail for how and why you killed someone, which is a completely different thing. And the world has never worked differently. Even when the law was, I don't know, if I kill you, I've killed some of yours, there was always a context that would mitigate it to an extent where such provisions wouldn't even necessarily be to be applied. Excuse me, drink a little. And just to put a patch on the sins of mankind, rather. There is a similar provision to the 1 million exemption of the Valdensians we talked about before, of which the tertiaries of St. Francis benefited after this period in Italy. We're talking about the penitents, the continents as they were called. A Valdensian woman was once examined by the Inquisitor, the Bishop of Pamiers, Jacques Fournier. We'll read a passage from him later, that registered, in fact, this answer from this Valdensian. That is to say, it's a very simple statement. Whoever kills a Christian in whichever war commits a sin. Right? So the naivety of this statement in the light of the Catholic tradition is astonishing. Every single action every human does is sinful. All right? Which doesn't mean that it is absolutely evil. It means just that it's rigged, it's imperfect. Right? Because humans, by definition, are imperfect if they find themselves in a human condition, not in a divine one. So here the woman was essentially saying that in general, like killing a Christian in a war seemed like such a bad thing that it could not be allowed to go on. And thanks my eyes, I mean, the entire purpose of the church, the papacy, in a pure political, historical sense, was to prevent bloodshed between Christians. The point is whether to consider, of course, an heretic Christian, which wasn't actually the case. But here the criticism was also towards a general idea of war, as it historically happened among Christians, among co-religionaries, also in the other religions everywhere. which is actually, like this woman was pointing out something, again, that the same church was after. In general, was the policy of the empire, and whichever greater power that wanted to cooperate with one another rather than making things escalate in a military sense. You can conquer people even without fighting, for that matter. So that's not the discriminant, really. But the entire deal with the Societas Christiana was perpetually repeated by the papacy. Look at what happened, especially in the early modern age, when the Turks were advancing. And the church was the only one basically saying, look, instead of fighting with one another, why don't we coalesce? The only guy that was saying the same was George Podobrati, the Hussite king of Bohemia, and it was actually saying that not because he gave a damn about fighting against others, but because he wanted to distract the attention from the fact that it was a freaking heretic king on a major European royal throne, and so that's eventually things were quite violent in his own policy. Basically, the entire policy that happens at this point. I will not even digress in order to explain all this in the obvious anthropological, historical, political context for which people thought at the time in general so much, right, compared to our own world. This, if you didn't notice, brought to the compaction of power into a better life. And civilization, materially speaking, was able to afford us that also in a general, say, security sense, right? There is no doubt that war here, war there, overall, we do live in a much more peaceful fashion today than practically ever in the history of mankind. And also a safer one to begin with as well. Naturally, it's not like things could not be reversed, but that's in fact something you work in order to fix. And this did pass through wars and settling matters in that more brutal way sometimes as well. So there is here not much we should add to what Parmenid tells us about this Valdensian. According to the Cathars, in theory, and we do not even exactly know to which extent and how many of the Cathars actually believed this, who was a Cathar in the first place, but it was forbidden to kill another person, even in time of war or to defend against like a criminal, which is also pretty weird. This is also considered that the Cathars in many ways were, for example, vegetarians for the same reason. They were actually vegan. They literally believed that matter was evil in everything, so the actual point of a Cathar was just to die. They were dualistic heretics, so they believed that essentially even like anything fleshy was bad, and so the ultimate point was just to kill yourself. Many of them actually starved themselves to death. Where all these practices oriented to the fact of the expiation of sins by mortifying yourself. So it was all they were communistic. There was all criticism of the one you call of materialism and consumerism. It's actually weird because normally communists themselves actually make this point often against what they call capitalism. Are materialists themselves, so nobody really understands where they're going with that, but it's always the same problem. So it's very difficult to understand, to begin with, why you wouldn't have to defend yourself from a criminal, and why killing someone in that sense was such a terrible thing to begin with in such circumstance. Also in times of war, it's the same thing, right? War in itself can be defined in many ways out the clear Clausewitzian definition. It is an act of violence aimed to compel your enemy to fulfill your will, which in this sense can be extended also to a brawl or a duel for that matter. In fact, according to the Saint von Clausewitz, war is nothing but a duel on a large scale. So the point is that the Cathars contemplated themselves also the idea of just war, at least in its causes, but for the mere fact that it killed, it was deemed to be criminal. So as a consequence, and that's where they were going at. What is Marxism pointing at, really? At exaggerating rulers. Why, by the way? Rulers are the ones that at large, aside from their mistakes and also, murder, etc., are at least the better choice than a leaderless state. But that's exactly where these people want to go. These are the lesser of society. They have less, they're envious, and they want everything to collapse so they can actually freely kill people without anybody stopping them. So the ambiguity, the hypocrisy, the cowardice, the ignorance, the blatant lie and evil that lays behind these ideologies is utterly insane, just for the fact that anybody ever came up with the idea of conceiving it, right? So also the judge that pronounced a death sentence was considered by the Cathars just as an assassin, even though, again, here we're talking about some Cathars, and we know this from it. It's not like Cathars, as we've seen, were not burning people at the stake, as a matter of fact, nor that were actually backing power that was sheltering them. So it was a total disaster in terms of moral or scientific standards, right? And even though there were some, again, rigorists and extremists that historically pushed for such more radically pacifistic ideas, this would not prevail in the church at any point, right? And while there was, especially in pre-Constantinian time, the sense of at least the empire is powerful, but they're evil because they're forcing us. Actually, we've seen in many videos that the Christians were actually offering to support the empire had they been accepted. Naturally, there was a jump to make that eventually did occur in the Roman Empire in terms of the split of state and church. That is actually not a positive thing at all, but that's where the times had come. The church simply found itself also from a condition of non-power, at least in a military sense, to achieve that, you see, in at least to simply recollect, say, spiritual power in a moment in which the emperors that had to be divine, in theory, were not so holding both earthly and spiritual power, right, in themselves, failing at it. Now, at least, say, simply were to be cooperating together, and we'll come back on that topic because I know some of you is interested in it. But here, the sense, in fact, that any kind of violence was simply to be not to happen whatsoever, to be considered at that point at the same level of any vulgar criminal is immediately debatable, and it does not belong to civilized society, right? Society is, in this sense, it may be the product of the fall, but we actually use such measures, so that sentencing, making wars, etc., to preserve this order, without which many more people would actually die. So we're doing our best in the meanwhile. It's not our best, we don't do it because we're bad, but in general, like, there are many positive things that come with this, and so one has to reflect of how do you want this world to be, right? Are you able to live in a reality, in surviving in a reality without enforcing the law in this way, also from a military point of view? Pacifism was also one of the components of the Lollard movement in England. One, because, again, these movements were never so clearly cut, whatever, especially the useful idiots that would be actually the ones used for violence, thought about this unitly is not relevant ipso facto. However, it's there is some interesting background there, because there were some English knights around the same period, slightly before, that may have even influenced themselves such pacifistic orientation. It happens in the Middle Ages to see men of war that decide to end their life in a monastery, so abandoning this bloody saculum, There are so many different approaches to that. To think about the monastic military orders that evidently make still violence and that spiritual preparation coexist, but there are instances in which some knights start saying, it was worthless, right? They start seeing it as, and this is true. Think about veterans today. There is a lot of, not just lots of veterans eventually end up siding with anti-war movements, but veterans that start questioning also in a broader sense the entire point of any other action. They're not maybe willing to kill anymore, or they feel like they couldn't do it for whichever psychological reason I'm not going to discuss. So it's always a variegated background. We find Nicholas the Hereford saying that Jesus Christ, leader of our battle, has taught us the law of patience and the renunciation to bodily combat. Right? This is slightly heretic because it suggests that some sort of dualistic understanding was typical also of the Cathars and this other Bogomils, which they stemmed from, and so on. The dualism is, itself, as you know, the most common misinterpretation of tradition in general, and I pronounced myself also recently in the video about the Germanic Imperial Catholic miracle in that sense. You cannot separate the spirit from the flesh, right? They're actually all coming from the same origin, and you cannot come back without either of the two, because also that's all what you practically have, and you have a transfiguring power from your life that is based on such union, by the way, that you have also another body and soul. So again, this is the same point we were making before. Yes, you should ideally behave like Christ, and ideally you should convince people and taking over the world with your sheer example. But can you? Yes, you could do that, but does it work? Like in your personal case, like believing like this, like did it bring, you may not know it because until you're dead, so it's just, what the people who come later will have told, but likely, are you able to do so? Right? That's always the big question of Catholicism, way before saying Christianity. Can you? Right? So claiming in this circumstance that your means are so beyond personally to simply make the difference in the world, and simply just by acting patiently and not killing someone, even if this person wants to kill you concretely in front of you, is it really the right way to go? Right? Some can do it. Right? The sense, of course, is in the entire martyrology was that, the great example of the Christian saints that simply became saints because they in fact witnessed Christ as martyrs, and so that is an example that is stressing mostly the fullest conviction of your cause in Christ, to the point that you do not even care about what happens on this world, rather than simply not reacting to what is going to happen to you at the moment. Like if you have a good idea of how to lead your life and to help people, why should you get yourself killed? Right? And especially also just not in the name of God. Like in that case, those were martyrs that were selected exactly because they were Christian and because they were not backing down in a system that was also individually outpowering them in a material sense. So they said our only way out is Christ in a spiritual sense. But in the later Middle Ages, in Christian Europe, like what is the point of claiming that, you shouldn't kill a murderer by law, or you shouldn't fight in a war? Like it may be, of course, that you could simply, there are some countries in the West have abandoned that sentencing because they think that example per se is not important, right? There are so immense philosophical implications behind that, and indeed the sense of using lethal force, for example, just as ex post, and cold blood for collective decision can be debated in general terms. Like, this is not to say that, but using lethal force against someone who is using lethal force against you, that's pretty universal. Like, there is no state, no institution says that cannot happen, and that's pretty much also what anybody is wired to do in a biological sense. That yes, maybe a rig, but that's exactly the point. That's the condition in which we are. We have one of the Lollard 12 theses condemned in 1395, stating that, quote, killing in battle is expressly contrary to the New Testament, in virtue of the injunction that Christ has made to men of loving, to have mercy of his own enemies and of not killing. These ideas, by the way, were present in part also in chivalry. The sense is that, yes, you had to fight, and you should have ideally outpowered your enemy just with your sheer moral force, and also including the physical one, without killing, and also being merciful so you would give a chance for this person to be redeemed. Yes, all nice, etc. But again, do you know, or did people know at the time, another way of doing it? Because it would be fantastic, like, if you could simply, okay, not kill anyone, just fixing the matter like that, and yeah, it's okay. It turns out that it doesn't work like that, exactly because we are fallen. So nobody doubts, again, this is sinful, and that, yes, in order to kill someone that is also using lethal force against you, there are ways not to do it, of course, but normally everybody gives green light to use lethal force back in these circumstances, legally speaking, for a reason that seems at least the bottom plan on which we find ourselves conditionally as humans in a conventionally organized society to react to this. So the sense here is that people were taking it. So of course these theses, for example, were going somewhere. Like, you see, here we find ourselves towards something more intelligent in general. In general, like, the concept is poignant. It's not to say that saying we shouldn't kill anyone is just a foolish idea you should throw in the bin just per se, but you should allow that person say, how do we actually leave that, right? We let anyone doing whatever they want because we don't react. How that does that work in the first place? Nobody really understands that. Nobody really gave an answer to that. And these movements, as we know, were also violent themselves. So again, what are we talking about? Like, if you are going to moralize, to preach, to criticize others, like, say be the first example of that, and as a group, as a system, and that was hardly the case. Another thesis here of the Lollards lists dismiss the armorer's art among the useless crafts of men that is necessary to suppress for the triumph of virtue. Right? So in other words, this is like people that complain here, don't send weapons to Israel, or I don't know, war is banned because, it's just the industries that benefit from that. It's all about corrupt. Yeah. Do you think that countries go at war because, there is a guy who pays a bribe? It does happen in most systems. In bigger ones, it doesn't work like that. You have to go through so many chains of the system. You have to withstand the entire public, and even if it was, like, maybe that's a good reason to fight in a war. Even if, as always, mathematically, physically, every action, of course, benefits people differently, and there is nothing to do about that either. Maybe that war is actually positive for the reasons we said before. Maybe it will actually save other people's life, because we do not have enough power on others, and not to do bad things, and in spite of our insistence of our civilizational cultural power, we're not able to make them stop, and so before they do anything bad, we kill them first. How do you work with that, right? What's more important, your absolutistic moralist, at the end of the day, relativistic, because every moral absolutism in this sense is relativistic by traditional doctrine. Or do you actually realize that people have to act, that it's actually mandatory to take action? Dante, for example, wrote that the worst thing politically, militarily, is not to take side, that people who do not do so are destined to be despised to the point they will just being pursued and eaten alive by insects at the gates of hell without even entering it. Or at least say for the abyss of hell without, because they would have been not worthy of people going in hell, right? And Dante, as you know, was not just like a random thinker, by the way. So it's interesting to read this Lollard thesis about these myths, because I'm planning to make a video about the Milanese armor, and as you know, we talk often about arms and armor, etc. And so looking at the peaks of arms and armor manufacture and production, business models, etc., as one of the peaks of medieval civilization, but the Lollards did not like that. And what does this sound like? It sounds like, there shouldn't be weapons. So there shouldn't. Why? Because there shouldn't be an authority to be able to use it to begin with. And it's not like if there are no myths that you can't kill people. Wycliffe criticized, by the way, the recurring to the Old Testament to justify war, which is also borderline Gnostic as far as this idea that the Old Testament was entirely surpassed and was nothing there useful. Here, of course, that's not what Wycliffe was literally saying, but the idea is that the Lord, God, Lord of battles, descending to war next to his people, was not good, right? It was actually still believed and always believed in the Assyrian regime in traditional cultures. We have seen it many times. And there are interesting documents coming from the trials celebrated against the same Lollards in the Diocese of Norwich between 1428 and 1431. These show that, according to one of the accused, that whichever the circumstances were, according to the Lollards, fighting was bad, right? The majority of the others sustain instead that evil is fighting for their own country or for an inheritance. And the reason brought, if anything, by everybody is that they had been indoctrinated in, is that acting like this means to lack of charity. And so that sort of makes sense, but there are many ways to make charity, including toughening up, right, and also defeating. Here you see, they're not even talking about killing. They're talking about fighting. So they were annulling even the possibility of sort of beating the hell out of someone, not killing him, to teach him a lesson that could be redeeming. And here, the most extremistic guy says that fighting anyway was bad, while the majority of the Lollards here trialed said that fighting is okay, but not if you fight for your own country, or not if you fight for an inheritance, right? Maybe you could fight for I don't know what, but in any case, this would have lacked charity. It seems particularly strange, by the way, but particularly random, because from one side of fighting for your country, okay, like so we talk about major wars, international implications, massive, sort of societal, political event. From the other side, it's a very private question, like fighting for an inheritance, like in a duel or something very provincial, local, familiar even. So it sort of sort of strange and doesn't take into account many other reasons. In the same way, according to these Lollards, it's bad, it's evil to sentence someone to death, even if this is done by following the legal procedures. Remember that in England, like, there was a very strong, so even though everywhere, like, there was common law and civil law was just sort of integrative of that, like, the English cared very much about the laws of their people. That, of course, were about killing homicides, right? And this is what the Lollards were saying, that it's bad and it shouldn't be done to kill a homicide, a thief, a traitor, because why? This is interesting, at least. Revenge has to be left to God. It's strange that I've actually almost ended up married with a girl who literally told me that she was a bit like that, sort of fringe to an extent, and from one time she said that, you know, she wanted to shoot poachers, and I said something like, I don't know, I want to kill people who don't make me sleep at night, because of the noise neighbors or whatever. Of course, I was sort of kidding, even though I was serious about the fact that, you know, I was exasperated at the time, but by that. And so she came up with a poachers thing, but then she said, no, I don't think that, say, violent, I remember what she said, but she said at the end that, you know, I believe that everybody gets the punishment that they deserve. I said, no, they don't. And then I thought back to the thing, and especially getting a bit more thoroughly into traditionalism. Yes, everybody gets what they deserve. But this includes what happens by the hands of other people. So actually, we're not to discern whether something is right or wrong just because somebody did it or not. Let's say whether people just left to God are going to exactly get what they deserve, so that we shouldn't consider our own intervention in this relevant. You see, this is what the Protestants were pointing out as far as the works, right? The works are useless. And so this starts going towards that direction, that basically you shouldn't do anything because kind of, you know, this whole business of life and civilization and whatever, it's useless. So you shouldn't even bother yourself to do anything. And people say that, you know, we beg to differ, and again, maybe it's just like a big illusion. Maybe truly, like in front of the infinite, our actions are almost null, but in that almost there is still something that is worth. Otherwise, what kind of law should there be? Like, why would you even be a human being to do what you do? How would you think that society would really live, right? You would have to be so exposed to anyone who wants to kill you as a sinner, let's say, at least as this most deteriorated form of sinner, according to your plan. It should be actually contemplated as pious or great or brave because you get yourself killed in that context without reacting, without doing anything to stop, without creating the means to actually allow people to develop themselves in a condition of this relative safety and stability that can help us reason all this. These are not questions to find an answer with. They're not even rhetorical per se. They are truly unknown in the answer, but they suspiciously apply also to all the movements that are trying to destroy the constituted order. That seems to be the only way to get enough power to come back to the one, or providing people with the means to develop themselves like that. Some people will say no, because civilization actually destroys everything, because these means are actually the ones that are literally like eroding like the capacity of life gradually. If anything, right, it's just a slower death than sort of destroy everything and taking other measures. The only problem with this is that the movements that propose this are actually the ones that create more attrition than anyone. And actually, they seem to be created to lose, because they seem to be the privileged target of the Orthodox Center to strike on, and to keep alive that sense of being up to a fight that they themselves express disproportionately, so that the system doesn't completely sclerotize. So it doesn't seem really exactly in this way. But there is a beautiful answer to all of this. In fact, against the pacifistic inclination of the Lollards, the Cambridge theologians Walter Brutt and William Swinderby resumed in these terms the position of the official church in 1393. So they said, fighting for the defense of justice, not only against the infidels, but also against the Christians, is in itself a holy and licit thing. Sustaining an opposite opinion means to be in error. According to this last opinion, it's not allowed to Christians to fight against the infidels, pagans, or others, to the end of obtaining their forced conversions to the Christian faith. It's sustained, by the way, that no Christian has to fight against other Christians for the defense of justice, but this judgment is false and erroneous for the following reasons. First of all, it would not allow to any Christian king to defend his kingdom against invaders or intruders. For example, the King of England wouldn't have the right to defend his lands against the French, the Scots, or others, etc. Secondarily, the teachings of the Holy Fathers have approved and sustained just wars as licit, and also allowed for Christians if their end is the defense of justice or the protection of the Church and of the Catholic faith. Thus, some saints approved by the Church have granted indulgences to men that were going to war for the aforementioned reasons. God himself has approved just wars of this kind, and truthfully has often ordered to an elect chosen people to fight, just as we can deduce from the reading of almost the entire Old Testament. We can thus be persuaded that this is the true Catholic doctrine, the contrary of which, sustained by the aforementioned proposition, is an error. Regarding the idea that to a Christian is forbidden to defend or to resist to an attack led with force, also this is an error. According to this opinion, Christians cannot deliberately defend themselves from injuries of any kind, both physical or other type. This is a very interesting point. Such opinion contrasts with the good of general peace, with every governmental order, and against every reason. It's a mistake to sustain it, and it has to be maintained the opposite opinion, according to which Christians can defend themselves with determination, first of all against the injuries that attack them unjustly, and they can oppose force to force, especially since the assailants are not threatened by an immediate punishment. This is a beautiful answer, especially the last part, because it doesn't even say, like, it says first that governmental order is a reason why you should act in self-defense, and by saying so, it's also explicitly saying that there may be good reasons to resist constituted authority, right? So it's actually saying that there is a capacity of everyone, right? This is in theory even against the sort of these people that were threatening public order, to criticize authority and to even take arms against it. But this must be done according to other criteria and reasons that have to help the general order. Like in this case, like you shouldn't make justice by yourself, but of course if you act in self-defense, killing someone lawfully, like you are safeguarded, because of course there can't be a police man behind every corner. And so here there is sort of a pretty subtle and mature view. The same idea again of, you can't fight for your own country. Why? Right? What's wrong with this? Doesn't seem. You see, even the Lollards here are, and just like the answer, are not insisting on bloodshed per se. Oh, I killed that guy. That's so bad. It seems as if they didn't care at the end of the day. What these theories were trying to undermine was the legitimacy of constituted power. Otherwise, why, for example, fighting for your own country, or for your own inheritance in particular, was what these Lollards answered. At least as a description, you see, the majority of people accepted that fighting for self-defense was actually necessary. Even the Lollards that we listed before. And the sense is, of course, that those they want to attack is societal norms, is political hierarchy, right? People don't want to fight for their country because who cares about this country? Who cares about the stability it provides? Who cares about the general good that can be done more functionally through it? If maybe there is a way to avoid that war. No, you will let somebody else invading it, and everything falling apart because fighting for it is bad. How's that even nearly responsible? Like, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So actually, this answer is overall quite simple, but it touches on some points that are difficultly, say, attackable. And here, even this sense that, for example, the Old Testament was simply showing that God sided with His chosen people is not simply. It's simple but not banal, right? It's meaningful because if you reject that, you reject basically the Holy Scriptures as a whole, if anything, because even if Christ changed a big deal, it's not like the law is simply superseded by saying that God was wrong before, right? That's what we should assume. So actually, this is, I think, a very solid answer, as simple as it is, and it's beautiful also how, at the end it says simply, this doesn't make sense. It's against any other reason. Like, all reason is against the idea that you can't defend yourself. And so these are important movements, important, say, important evidence from some of the most important instances of revolt or social reform at the time. As you know, they were pretty radical in their objectives. For not talking about the Hussites, right? Here the situation is slightly different. First of all, the Hussites are a bit less, civilized people than the Lollards themselves. Bohemia is not England, but there is definitely a favorable tendency to war that justified resistance against crusaders in the name of the truth, of the innocence, and the fatherland. Naturally, the Hussites, as you know, had different currents within themselves. There were the Taborites were more rigoristic, the worldly issues of more strictly doctrinal in terms of ultraquism, this administration of the Eucharist by both kinds. There were the Adamites that ended up being exterminated, that literally said, okay, we should just go out there, naked and whatever. And the more, say, what always stands out is that sort of the more extremistic the instances, the more messed up the actual political outcome, right? These did not create, say, the more extremistic, the more people died. We should point it out, not just in retaliation, but literally as far as the general destabilization of the situation, the general violence contained even within the same groups was concerned. There is a tendency within the Hussites, represented by the theorists of the unity of the Bohemian brothers, Peter Czelczyński, that postulated a non-violence, essentially. Czelczyński basically laughs about the hypocrisy of those who are very careful about not eating pig, pork on Friday, but they spread, they more or less gladly human blood. According to him, in the first age of the church, pacifism had reigned. This is wrong historically. We know it very well. Even just in theory, even though the Christians were emarginated, they didn't have their own army or their own state, or state backing that list. The sense was that would have been a golden age, and for the mere fact that the church was not, essentially was preaching pacifism, at least leaving without killing. Czelczyński says that Christian law must be about, love, of course, like prohibiting homicides. He interestingly says that the subjects to this law must also obey the state, which was actually like a historical thing, also in Judaism, in Christianity before this. Therefore, rendering back to Caesar what is of Caesar. But in this sense, say not going against him, because as you know, the phrase is often translated as give to God what is God and Caesar to Caesar. No, you have probably to restitute to Caesar according to the liminal idea of how important the spiritual side of the story should be compared to the world. But this doesn't mean that you, as a human being, again, have simply the capacity of doing it. This is what Christ means with that word. It's just like a direction. Consider what the power of the soul is about, and then think about the world. If you have to, if you can't do without. However, Czelczyński said that yes, you should obey the state, but you should refuse public functions, because they had to do essentially with also the enforcement of law in this sort of homicidal way that was forbidden, and military service for the same reason. So in other words, you should have just been sort of out there in the world without really participating to politics or to war, or at least not covering a specific office, in having a governmental position, but and not going to war. That's it. You do your work, you do everything, you obey the law, you don't create problems, but you don't do this other stuff. In other terms, such heterodox currents, essentially, we already pointed out, were from one side trying to extend to the collectivity and public power some interdictions that, according to the traditional interpretation of the church, concerned only the privates and individual actions, and on the other, to impose to the totality of the Christians a pacific behavior that the official church reserved to the clergy and those who aspire to perfection. And this is interesting because the latter aspect indeed is something that the church was sort of wishing really for the entire Christendom. Right? You want people to have some Christ-like behavior. But here there is an intent to curb properly all type of sort of imperial power to an extent that you can't even kill anyone in self-defense, for example, or even in ways that come to dispossess you, come to kill you. And so what is at that point the better person? Of course, what pertains of this world is, as we've seen, null virtually in front of God. But in this sense, why does this aspect matter so much? What is that actually people have to attain by behaving like this? This is always the same point. Yes, it will be some sort of greater, say, the avoidal of sinning, the avoidal of killing, just by the same, absence of violence. But what about all the people that in this system will simply essentially be killed by those who still want to kill them? And also, what about the destabilization of the system? And especially accordingly, and whose responsibility would that be? Of course, yes, these people were right in the measure in which it's simple, like this should be valid for everybody. There shouldn't be people who kill others to begin with, not just you, right? You shouldn't even be concerned with your personal safety, because if God wants you to be killed, here it depends. Some people say you should act in self-defense, some don't, because at that point it's either you or me, right? So how do you make the map? But the question is always is the more real one. That is to say, but are you able to do so? Right? Did the same people who actually live by these principles actually respect it? Did they actually achieve anything more stable than what civilization does? Normally, were these movements were first of all pacific, and secondly, were they able to get anywhere in terms of their sheer Christomimesis? The answer is obviously no. And so here we're not really wasting time regarding how things should be if you're not able even to convince anyone, right? If your action is eventually simply, like if I didn't make this video, for example, how many people would actually even talk about this stuff on YouTube in 2024? So how relevant were they? Today we don't even talk about Gandhi anymore. What was I was a kid that these people said, Gandhi, non-violence, etc. But aside from the fact that Gandhi would have used guns if the Indians had them to begin with, but still also like hampering a governmental action does cause trouble. It's not simply saving people's lives just per se. And here, at least, again, the destabilization of the civilization is coming with losses, with issues, with lots of complications that we haven't found really a better answer to than civilization. So yes, you want to behave better, okay, but civilization kind of produce that, right? It does not actually reduce the amount of destructive capacity, but it's also kind of doing it for the sake of self-preservation, right? If at least of augmentation of that power and the actual hope that it's not to be using it anymore. Like it's not like civilization emerges with the purpose of simply, meeting anyone they can to destroy them. If anything, they want to extend their power on them, which of course is coming to cost and to sacrifice and war if these people exist. But even about that, what about convincing them? What about the same law of God? Right? What if, in fact, you are the one who is living by, this is the paradox, by this law, by trying not to kill and other people kill you? Who are you letting win? Yes, of course, in the world, again, we're meant to suffer and everything, but the question is, shouldn't there be a redeeming action of people in the world that actually works to say lots of people get massacred without anybody really caring about it? So there are, if anything, some civilizational contexts, including the ones of the early martyrs, that seem to be much more clamorous. Christianity won in a place like the Roman Empire. Do you know of lots of other people, including likely Christians, that were massacred, say, in the Pontic steppe, and that you don't even know they existed? Civilization is an amplifier of this, and the fact that there are people who disagree is not positive, right? The fact there are, in the answer to the Lollards before we read it, they actually answered, as I think the first thing, that the necessity of converting the heathens, the infidels, is actually justifying the use of violence by itself. That's a very powerful statement, because you would say, well, you shouldn't do it. Why? Why shouldn't you allow people to live under the law of God? And why, say, would you leave them spreading it if you know that they are actually wrong? Is that enough to kill? The answer there would be you should convince them of the worthiness of your cause. Yes, but what if we are too fallen for that? It's always a matter of math. You could again argue that war again is not the answer, but then what is these people take over and they even destroy your own religion? Is this really the actual thing that you want for the church? Aren't the same values necessary, even just to bear arms, right? And this, we're still living in a reality in which there is a papacy and an empire that actually cooperate, right? So we're not talking about a situation in which people are saying, okay, well, simply should be no authority whatsoever. Isn't there the capacity of wielding the imperium in itself inspiring? As within Catholic law, the capacity to see what civilization should be working like. Aren't there people who are supposed to defend the church in arms by shedding blood in order to achieve a greater good? These are questions really that had already been answered by the great fathers of the church for a long time. So these positions were a bit just untenable by themselves. If anything, you understand that these heretics were just taking a utopistic tangent, skipping everything again that is in between, the world itself. And so how you should redeem this world with rigged means, if not by using them for what they are. Right? This is the point. Then, of course, there can be a mistake, there can be an excess of power, of authority, of violence. There is no doubt. Killing is always a sin. Every action is a sin. The point is finding the ways and the reasons to do something that is beyond that redeems you, right, in the process. And so we there is a response to the Inquisition that a Valdensian deacon gave in 1321 to the aforementioned Jacques Fournier. We're talking about Raymond de Sainte-Foix. He was a Valdensian who was interrogated and admitted in this way. It is granted to secular power to put to death or to mutilate the evildoers, because without this there wouldn't be nor peace nor security among men. So Valdensian actually gave green light to this. He also admitted that it's just and licit to kill or to make die the heretics, such as the Manichaeans. And it's interesting, again, this is a Valdensian saying that if they don't want to come back to the faith and to the unity of the Roman Church. He also admits that those who kill and sentenced to death evildoers or heretics can save their own soul. So there is always, again, a value of works and the possibility of redemption. So in other words, killing itself, if you think about it, it's as if every action can truly, every lost moment to achieve salvation is potentially murderous for the entire mankind. Right? Killing someone doesn't seem, in this sense, like, but the most straightforward way of doing some sin that, however, again, depending on the context, may actually succeed in doing good, right? So this is very interesting from a metaphysical point of view. Yes, because you can destroy a part of humanity in this sense, but how relevant is it in the bigger picture? How much in front of the infinity of, even if it were just your own, just think about all the mankind's transfiguring power, redeeming capacity, and divine potential is the life that you have taken away. I get this is terrifying to think about it, but it also makes sense. Today we don't even talk about the fact that, again, in before Christian times, where at least this specific message was more emphasized to an extent, like there was a greater emphasis in Catholicism, the so-called, and as improperly called, pagan world, towards the idea of ritual killing. Right, the same gladiators, the same sacrifice of the spolio opiments that were all believed to actually add power. I mean, if you managed to own the force that lived within that person, you had toughened yourself up to an extent that could be spent for the benefit of society, especially if this came out of a contrast with, in fact, an enemy that, just by the fact that had a different opinion from yours, they would say by losing, but say either of the two would be worse than the other, and so say less worthy. This doesn't answer much the fact of but how worthy it was to kill this person, but given that most of this occurred through external warfare than internal one, and an internal one was even more perniciously detrimental, everything seemed to find its own right proportion. Right? The Waldensian here, 3021, thinks that it is legitimate and just to fight against the pagans, the infidels that, warned by the church, refuse to convert, and furthermore that it's illicit for a Christian prince to fight against other Christians, to literally respond to the insults, to attack the violent, to punish the lack of faith or the disobedience. All right. What was this Waldensian disagreeing with the church about, though? Because he wasn't just all agreeing. He thought of himself to be a perfect, right? And so, as such, he said, I reached a level of the thing of the perfect, as you know, was present also among the Cathars, etc., was essentially a state of higher moral accomplishment that exactly in a sort of imitative sense, and this is what the Waldensian answer, in fact, prevents them to partake into these different actions, to the point that if a brigand, for example, wanted to kill him, he would just limit himself to prevent that from happening physically with a stick or with a sword. And if he had killed him, if he had killed the brigand, he would have felt to have committed a sin. However, not such a serious one as if he had killed like a good man. So this is actually a very shaded view of the situation, and he thought that, you see, also knights were reasoning that term of, yes, I will outpower you, and I will, as we were saying before, just essentially redeem you because of my example, right? So this is what essentially the Waldensians was thinking about, except he was doing so by claiming himself to be a perfect, right? To have reached a level of moral virtue that, to an extent, could not be simply categorized by such individual claim, right? As you know, in the Catholic system, there is no such thing, right? There is a hierarchy. There are different levels of responsibility in this sense, but there is no such that, aside from all the other issues that the Waldensians had with the Roman Church, that was the main reason why the Waldensians were persecuted in the first place. I made some videos about Peter Waldo in the far times of Schwerpunkt, and so in front of these videos, it's always difficult to simply say, okay, this is it, because we touch on so many different topics that you can't quite simply say, well, all right, it's done, right? This is all what we have to talk about or to explain. No, it's very complex, and it takes time to look at in proper detail. However, we have sort of presented the main case of why these positions, for even if when it's inspired to a higher principle that is to be found in the Holy Scriptures, at least in a the Holy Scriptures do not say it in a categoristic way. Everything, you can argue that everything that is so categorical is part of a dimension that you can transcend. In fact, the same Catholicism, as far as the right is concerned, is quite flexible. There are exceptions depending on the situation. So, if anything, it's more like a discipline that must be followed in general, and then if there is a good reason to disobey it, the church will will actually forgive you, because still it is a sin. It still shouldn't be because there is an additional one against the same church in the same discipline. And so what this embodies and it entails, right? But the sense of this different organization and an idea of a rigid categorical prohibition without an actual capacity to maintain those same standards, and mostly bending them to a very specific political aim, because he claims a moral superiority that was not owed by nor the individual nor by the groups that were at this point trying to discipline, again, a higher authority, and mostly for the sake of what? Of letting the world collapse after so much civilizational effort, and placing themselves also above the same authorities, but without actually being an expression, say, of a major, I don't know, part of the population or whatever. It's all very very complex, because this is just the symmetry at a point, at least at the lower end of the before the Reformation, and so we're in the presence of a much, say, of some sort of discontent that was mounting towards the ecclesiastical hierarchies, but in this sense, evidently also something else, like a broader sense towards the concept of authority as it was historically constituted. And in fact, you can argue that this, you see immediately, even within the Lollards, not everyone is so sort of radical for those ideas that wouldn't be surpassed, because of course, like especially this idea of killing was not part much of the for example, the Protestant instances of reform, etc. It's a much bigger thing. And in fact, it succeeded to a greater extent, but because also the standards of the elite were sort of gradually, at least preventing some groups in Europe to be ordered, right, to be up to their own task of controlling them. All right. But we will talk more about this. Sorry if towards the end I sound a bit more tired and lost, whatever, but well, I have a lot to do. Making these videos is, of course, a hobby of mine, but there is also a lot to do and it's hard, so every once in a while I exhaust myself towards the end. I start with good propositions, but then time runs out and I have also to finish. However, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.